Um, Thank you. I appreciate Kyle, Jody, Trent, Mark giving kind of the background and tours of this project. This this has been one of the most fun projects I've been involved with here at USU. It's been just a great pleasure to work with these agents and with Kyle as a graduate student and with cooperating farmers. As they've kind of shared here, we've worked kind of directly, heavily with 11 producers on 12 fields the last year and a half to really try to find ways to save, cut back on water without making a big dent in the pocketbook. And so today I've got to go quickly here, but I want to just share some initial results for three questions that we're trying to answer. And these have been talked about previously, but one, do new sprinkler parts help? Can we reduce irrigation rates a little bit? And does advanced irrigation scheduling techniques work? So first, does new equipment help? So those 12 pivots that we've been talking about, the sprinkler packages on those pivots ranged from really young, new. We had some that were just a year or two old, and then we had some that were up to 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. That red dashed line there is where most sprinkler companies will indicate that you need to start replacing equipment. Sprinkler heads, nozzles, regulators generally start to go about that point. So we had quite a few that were under that, and we had a couple that were over. We really wanted to find a lot more that were over, but this is what we ended up with. So last year, we collected data from 37 cuts of alfalfa. Impressive amount of work to get that data on 12 farms. And what we found is about 90% of the time, about 75% of the time, no impact of adding new equipment. So this is new regulators, new nozzles, new sprinkler heads, the whole thing. So about 75% of the time, no impact. About 15% of the time, we had a decrease in yield, and we're not sure why that happened. But only about 10% of the time did we see an advantage. Did we see yield increase when we had brand new equipment on those pivots? It could be that some of those packages were still just quite new and were not worn yet. There's a lot here, but I just want to point out really quickly those 5 blue circles, and they just show where those yield increases happened. And I just want to point out quickly, if you can see my mouse here, is that in the first cut is where most of those differences happened. We had four farms in the first cut where there was a yield increase with new equipment. Then you get into the second cut, the third cut, the fourth cut, and we had less and less. We only had one in the fourth cut where we saw an advantage. And also want to point out that it wasn't the same farms. So it was random farms and random cuts did we see advantages with new equipment. So really not consistent benefits. 2020, we're still putting a lot of this data together, so we don't have a lot of it summarized yet, but just quickly to show you two farms, the first cut in 2020, the new equipment still is not showing much advantage yet. Oh, excuse me, I jumped back, apologize. Okay, second question, can we cut back on irrigation rates? So what kind of impact does a 10% reduction in the rate have on yield? So again, we had 37 cuts, and only on about 14% of the time, so just a few cuttings on a few farms, did we see a loss in yield with 10% less water. This was great. It means if a farmer's in a watertight situation and they need to cut back a little bit, it's likely that they can reduce their rates by 10% and have very little impact on production. Again, a similar chart that I showed you before. Look at the red circles. There's 5 of them. It was 5 cuts where we saw a yield decrease with 10% less water, but it wasn't the same farms and it wasn't consistent for cut after cut. And so just a positive sign there that we can probably cut back 10% and have very little impact. Again, some results for 2020 on just 2 farms. Again, we're still not seeing much impact of the 10% reduction in the rate. For that first farm, it does look a little bit lower, but when we run the statistics, it's really not different. There's enough variation in the yield that we just can't detect a difference between those 2. Okay, the third question, does advanced scheduling help? So last year we were able to get data off of 15 cuts on a number of different farms, different cuts. And really out of those 15, only 2 cases did we see less yield with a different schedule. So on one farm with irrigation scheduler and another farm with field net advisor. So very little impact of irrigation schedules in the first year. We did see a change in water use though. Some of our advanced techniques using the soil moisture sensor, the irrigation scheduler program, or the field net advisor, we often saw that we reduced the amount of water that we applied without really impacting yield. And the soil moisture sensor had, on average, had the best ability to do that, the best ability to reduce the rates and not impact our production. In 2020, again, just off of 2 farms, on the first cut, we're again seeing very little impact of these irrigation scheduling approaches. I will mention, and we didn't talk a lot about it, but we are starting to see some quite striking visual differences in the alfalfa for some of these different irrigation schedules. So we suspect that time will start to show more and more difference in these different approaches to scheduling irrigation. So to sum it up, we really saw little, I guess keep in mind 2019 was wet, and so we think that really impacted the results that we saw. But a couple of things to take away is that we really think there's some opportunity to cut back by 10% and not have huge impacts on your production. 2, we really saw minor benefits of replacing equipment. Now, remember that we only had 4 that were had quite old sprinkler packages. And so we do not recommend keeping your equipment on for 10, 15, 20 years. But think carefully and watch it carefully as it gets near that 5, 6, 7 years old to make sure that you replace that equipment when it needs to be replaced. And the jury's still out on these irrigation scheduling approaches. We're hoping they're economical, that they work, but as of yet, we're seeing little impact in terms of yield, but we are seeing some reduction in water use. So it means that using some of these techniques might help you save water without having much impact on your production. That we thank a lot of cooperators, a lot of companies and others that have contributed to this, and I'll close.